Welcome to Thought to Action, presented by the London Center for Policy Research, where we delve deeply into important issues, examine ideas, and discuss solutions, and put our thoughts into action. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, President of the London Center for Policy Research, and I hope if you like what we're doing here, you'll join our Patreon, like, share, subscribe to videos. It always helps the algorithm, and be sure and look for us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and of course at the londoncenter.org. Today, we are joined by one of our former senior fellows and a Reagan conservative, like many of us who've been a big believer in the principles of what the conservatives have done over the years, and most importantly, a Trump administration official. So Monica, welcome to Thought to Action. Thank you for joining me today. It's an honor to have you here with us.
Tony, it's such a joy to be with you. Thank you so much for having me today. Lots to talk about.
Oh yeah, so let's jump right into that. So one of the things that I hope you don't mind, we've talked about off air, is the importance of the work you had done, were doing in your job as part of the Trump administration. I'd like you just to kind of summarize what you were doing. And I'd like to do a couple of follow-up questions to talk about how impactful it actually was. This is something I think the public needs to understand that they still don't understand. And look, I would argue, based on someone who was advising the Trump administration from the outside, you guys were actually very active in trying to find the best solution to actually resolve things, not to take advantage politically. Imagine that, trying to help the American people. But could you go through kind of your experience in the Trump administration and what you were doing there when you were appointed?
Sure. And thank you for asking that question, Tony. I appreciate it very much, because serving my country is something that I always wanted to do. This country has been very good to me and to my family over many decades and a couple of generations. And I just always wanted to give back. And in fact, my first job out of college was with former President Richard Nixon.
There you go. Wow.
Beginning of my career. And then I was mid-career with President Trump. And I like to joke, Tony, that I really know how to pick them. Only the most controversial presidents for Monica, no boring presidents for me. But it was such an honor for me to go into the Trump administration and serve him and his agenda, as well as Treasury Department. So I served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Public Affairs. And I started in May of 2019 and served through January 20th of this year, 2021. So I was there in a couple of really critical periods. We like to call it pre-pandemic, pandemic, and then post-pandemic. So in the early days of my tenure at Treasury, Tony, we were executing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. So it was an across-the-board tax cuts, which benefited every American and helped to generate the booming Trump economy that we enjoyed before the pandemic. Then, of course, the pandemic hit, and we scrambled to save the US economy in an unprecedented situation. This is one of those things where, I think a lot of people have lost sight of the fact that neither President Trump nor Secretary Mnuchin could pick up the phone and call a predecessor and say, what did y'all do during the last pandemic?
Exactly.
Because it didn't exist. So everybody was flying without a net. And we did, I think, an extraordinary job in protecting America's workers and businesses and industries during that very acute period of time of crisis, from about March of 2020 through about Memorial Day of 2020. We stood up all kinds of unprecedented programs to get America's small businesses and airlines and national security businesses and so on stabilized, and through that period of time, to the point where 1 year ago, about Memorial Day of last year, you saw a lot of red states starting to open up economically. So President Trump presided over the fastest economic recovery from any crisis on record.
Right.
Those are things that we are all incredibly proud of.
So thank you for that great summary. And again, I think that this is a story that I think needs to be told a lot more, because obviously the media tends to suppress fact and emphasize propaganda for their own purposes. And that's something that you and I have both been victimized from. multiple times. The media is the first to run with a lie and expand it to its maximum effect without checking on the facts. So it's amazing. So I think that's where the work you all did was phenomenal. And as you point out, the red states started moving towards reopening immediately. That's reflected in the economic numbers that the most successful states at this point in time, post-pandemic, are all red states, surprise, surprise. And it's those that moved rapidly forward to understand that the COVID was manageable. It, for the most part, was something that if you took proper precautions and followed science, imagine that, you're going to be fine. And I know a number of people who had it. Several of our mutual friends have had it. They came through it just fine. But again, it's the left who used the pandemic for two very serious things. First, to further push progressive policies regarding collectivization and control. And secondly, and I think probably more importantly, to hide their errors of judgment regarding how to protect people, like Cuomo, putting people in nursing homes and murdering them. Well, he had a ship, U.S. Navy ship, and the Javits Center. I know for a fact that my colleagues set up the Javits Center as a hospital. The left took advantage of the pandemic, and I think we're still suffering from that. Would you agree with that premise?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, recalls Saul Alinsky's famous mantra, never let a crisis go to waste. So the left has really embraced that over many decades and leveraged a lot of different crises to their advantage. It's always about power and control with them. And with every passing day, Tony, we see new news stories about hydrochloroquine,
right,
ivermectin, and so on, that the left in various institutions, whether it's the CDC or NIH, you name it, they were blocking a lot of things simply because President Trump got wind that perhaps these things might work, and they put a stop to it simply for political reasons. To me, that is unconscionable. You do not mess with people's livelihoods and their very lives.
right.
And yet that's what we saw happen over the last year and a half, which to me is just unforgivable. But setting that aside, yeah, I mean, the left just leveraged this. Their whole mission is to fundamentally transform the nation, Obama's words, not
right,
mine. And they do it in every way possible. So they're looking to re-engineer and reshape this country away from its foundational principles of individual freedom and limited government and toward a more European-style socialist system where you've got a heavy hand of governance from the ruling elite and then everybody else, and you have a more collectivist socialist economic model. And so they saw an opportunity last year and they took it.
So their greatest ally in this entire power grab and expansion of, I'll just say it, Maoist control of the government. I'm going to be far more unkind than you are, Monica, about what they're doing. I think that there's a clear direction they're going, and it's to emulate what China's doing. As you know, China has taken control of its internet. If you want to live as a citizen, you must have a certain credit score because your credit score is tied to your behavior as a citizen. Look, I think the People's Republic of China, the CCP, is the greatest ally of the left right now, because I think they see things the same way. Am I being over the top here with this?
No, not at all. I mean, if you think back through American history of the 20th century, it was originally a KGB operation to try to undermine the United States from within. And so
right,
they came in and they got the leftists and progressives and sort of they grabbed control over the major pillars of American society,
right,
academia, entertainment, the culture, the media. And when the Soviet Union fell apart, the Chinese were very smart to step into the void. And so this is now largely a Chinese Communist Party project to, like termites, corrode America's institutions. This has been a multi-decade operation. They are very long-term in their thinking. I remember President Nixon used to say to me that Americans thought in 2 and 4 year cycles because that's our electoral system, whereas the Chinese think in 100-year cycles.
right.
So they're very willing to be patient. But the fruits of this operation, which started, 80 years ago, are now coming back to really haunt us, and we better be prepared for the fight.
No doubt. And I think that's where we're at right now. And it's interesting that one of the biggest tools I've seen the left use, which the communist Chinese are happy to try to push, is this woke concept. One of the things London Center is trying to do, we've talked about this before, is to examine the parallels between the woke society and social justice system and Mao, because many of the tenets of both are the same. It's simply a different marketing technique for the different cultures they're designed to go against. And so with that said, one of the things that people don't seem to understand, and I think it's notable, is this idea of critical race theory. And for those who have not studied it, critical race theory is simply the concept that everybody is inherently racist, whether you know it or not. So basically, according to critical race theory, if you believe that critical race theory is correct, you're a racist because you believe it. And if you don't believe critical race theory, you're a racist. I mean, this is the left's thinking, Monica. How does someone circle that square with such insanity now being put forth as an academic construct within our education system?
Well, again, Tony, it's all part of the broader leftist project to remake the nation, fundamentally transform it, as Obama said. So, when you're dealing with the left, it's never about the superficial issue that they say it's about. It's about something much deeper and more profound. Right. And they just use the superficial issue to leverage it to gain ever more power and make these changes to American society that they're looking at. So in critical race theory, it is a Marxist philosophy, Bingo. But rather than traditional Marxism, which seeks to divide people by class, they're dividing by race. Mm-hmm. And because race is such an emotional issue and can be leveraged, worst thing anybody can be called is a racist, and then there's really no coming back from that. The left understands that, and they've weaponized it. But what they're doing with CRT in the schools is indoctrinating children of all ages down to kindergarten level, for goodness sakes, right. Which is essentially child abuse. And they're trying to indoctrinate kids so that the next subsequent generations will not even think that there is an alternative way of thinking about America. And that to me is incredibly dangerous. That's why you're seeing a lot of parents now starting to push back, and they're parents of all races, Tony. Right. And you're starting to see the left kind of panic a little bit that we are onto them. And you've got parents, again, of all races pushing back and saying, not my child. They're not going to learn to judge people by the color of their skin, but rather by the content of their character. And thank goodness for it, because it's gotten entrenched, but maybe it's still in the early enough stages where we can salvage it and stop our kids from being indoctrinated.
Well, I certainly hope so. And I see through their parallel teachings the idea that certain classes of individuals based on skin color are less capable of understanding how to vote. Chris Murphy, Connecticut senator, was actually talking publicly about his belief that somehow because people's skin is different than others, they have an inherent inability to understand things. I think we fought for the last 100 years, Monica, to remove that sort of thinking from any part of our civilized thought. And it's interesting that the left continues to circle back to it. It's incredible. How do you explain the left not understanding that racism is bad? And I'll just put it that way.
Well, remember, the history of the Democratic Party is racist. I mean, they were the party of the Ku Klux Klan, for goodness sake, right? And American kids are not taught that at all. They think that the Democrats were the party of saving the Republic. Well, that only happened in the 20th century when the Democrats came in and started speaking to the inner cities and urban communities and African Americans, and created an entire, they created a cult of victimhood. Right. But more and more African Americans are waking up to that as well. Look, the American people need to understand the truth of what the history is here and really what the objective is of the left. Democrats very rarely go into urban areas and talk to the African American community. God bless Donald Trump for actually doing that.
Exactly.
For creating opportunity zones, which were run largely out of the Treasury Department.
Right.
Criminal justice reform. He actually intangibly improved the lives of African Americans in this country. That's why he got a pretty substantial chunk of the vote in 2020, because remember his line in 2016, what the hell do you have to lose?
Yeah.
Well, he actually delivered for that community, along with Hispanic Americans, women, veterans, Americans with disabilities, Asian Americans. Every demographic group benefited from President Trump's economic and other policies. And that's why, or one of the reasons why, Tony, Donald Trump was an existential threat to not just the Democratic Party, but the entire ruling class. And that's why they have spent the last 5 years trying to destroy him.
And they continue now to focus on him. It's amazing how little attention's paid to Joe Biden, which is not good, by the way, based on the mistakes and I would argue for clear plans to undermine everything President Trump did. The left seems to continue to focus on President Trump, but I think I'd like to have you back at some point to talk more about the economic zones, because I think that's one of the best things that President Trump and you all introduced. I've seen these things work very well in Philadelphia and some other places when given the chance to work incubation centers where innovation and entrepreneurship is rewarded. And I think the idea here is to actually expand the middle class. Imagine that. Imagine this expanding, no matter what the color of your skin, the ability of families to essentially form their own path forward without reliance on government. And I think that's the danger here, Monica. The Democrats don't want people not dependent on government. I think that's why they kick and scream every time you create conditions for freedom, enterprise, and economic growth. It's very sad.
Yes, I mean, they are on a project to make as many people dependent on government as possible, because that means more power and control in their hands. And this is also one of the reasons why, Tony, when you look at the most recent economic proposals from the Biden administration, you see them proposing, first of all, tax hikes that are going to affect pretty much every American, not just the rich and not just corporations. They've got to go after the middle class because that's where the real money is. So that's number one. Number two, you see widespread inflation, which is a hidden regressive tax, meaning it impacts those at the lower end of the income scale more intensely than it does at the top. Rising prices, if you're earning less, you don't have that much of an ability to pay those higher prices.
Right.
So it's essentially tax. Thanks, Joe Biden, for that. But they're also trying to leverage the entire economic system so that the new tax regime, if they get it through, Tony, will reach into the middle class and make the middle class ever more dependent on government. That's extremely dangerous, but again, part of their fundamental transformation.
Yeah, so look, they're now attempting universal income, base income, through a back door. I got a letter 2 weeks ago offering me payments per child indefinitely starting midsummer. Starting next month, if I put in, apparently if I have a certain income, the government's going to pay me, not allow me to take deductions off my taxes, which is legit. They're going to pay me a certain amount of money for the number of kids I have. This is a backdoor way of implementing this universal income that AOC and others have been proposing. And it's a complete MacGuffin. It's a complete fraud. Money does not self-generate. You have to have businesses out there working and income and middle class generating that. It seems to me another method they're trying to use to end the economic dream or the ability of people to generate. So it's quite insidious.
Absolutely. And, they're tireless, right? Some folks on our side, they have real jobs, they have families, they are not 100% focused on what's going on. But I think every American needs to understand that the left in this country is at war.
Yeah.
They're at war with the Constitution, they're at war with individual liberty, and they're at war with free enterprise, the capitalist system. And they won't stop until they've destroyed those things.
Right.
And one last point I want to make about this, Tony,
Sure.
They have the protection of the press.
Oh.
When you have the protection of the press, you can literally get away with anything because there's no accountability and no transparency, and none is demanded of them. And so that's why they have largely been able to get away with as much as they have.
So we must, on our side, those who are trying to fight the war on objective truth, and that's what it is. They're trying to basically deny basic truths for purposes of putting forth their philosophy and their propaganda. It's very dangerous. Monica, thank you for joining me today. By the way, before you go, I too have worked for every president, modern president in some form, but I have an admission to make. The first president I actually worked for was Jimmy Carter. I hate to say it, I was actually on a detail in Lisbon, Portugal, and during the summer hire, I went to high school in Lisbon, and I worked for President Carter. I hope you don't hold that against me, though. I really,
not at all. No, you know what? It's a huge testament to your character and the way America used to be.
That's
where
true.
You were bipartisan. You could serve a president of either party as long as it was always in the best interest of America. That unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. But between you and me, Tony, we're going to bring it back, aren't we?
Well, look, I live in Northern Virginia, at least for now, and one of the great stories I tell people is about Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, getting with Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill at a place called Ireland's Own, just a few miles down the road in Old Town Alexandria. They could set aside their differences and be Irish for a night and just be Irish Americans and enjoy the American dream. That is gone at this point. But like you, I look forward to working with you and others who have now dedicated themselves to restoring the Republic and preserving the American dream as best we can. So Monica, thank you for joining us today. And thank you all for watching and listening to Thought to Action. If you like this program and like to expand our content, please join our Patreon community. Please like, share, subscribe. Be sure, and if you join our Patreon community, you get to post questions regarding Ask Us Anything. It's our way of going through a whole series of things that people who are supporters of the center get to ask us questions about. So thank you for joining me today. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, the president of the London Center, and we'll see you again real soon.